Hello, welcome back to the Phantom Diary channel. I'm sure there are many of you listening to my stories to fall asleep. Before we start, write in the comments what country you're listening from. If you feel fear, you should like and subscribe this channel. So, let's go. We hadn't planned to go so deep into the woods. It started as a simple hiking trip. Me, Ethan, and Lily just following the marked trails, enjoying the fresh air. But curiosity got the best of us when we spotted the old path. It was barely visible, swallowed by the forest, as if nature itself wanted it forgotten. "We should check it out," Ethan said, grinning. "Just for a little bit." Lily hesitated. "If it's not on the map, maybe it's abandoned for a reason." That only made it more tempting. The deeper we walked, the more the forest changed. The trees were taller here, ancient, their trunks twisted unnaturally. The air felt heavier, as if we had stepped into a place untouched for centuries. Then we saw the village. Crumbling wooden cabins stood between the trees, their roofs caved in, windows shattered. Moss and vines had claimed everything, weaving through broken doors and up-rotting walls. There was no sign of life, no birds, no insects, just silence. "This is insane," I whispered. "Why is there no record of this?" Ethan wandered ahead, pushing open a door. The cabin creaked and dust swirled in the dim light. Inside, the furniture was still there. Tables, chairs, even dishes set out on a dining table, as if whoever lived here had left in the middle of a meal. Lily picked up a plate. "This doesn't make sense. Why would everything still be here?" Then we heard it. A soft, rhythmic knocking. We spun around. The sound echoed from another cabin. 3 slow knocks. Then silence. Ethan laughed nervously. Probably just the wind. But there was no wind. The knocking came again. Closer this time. 3 knocks. Slow. Deliberate. We backed away. I glanced at the trees, suddenly feeling watched. The forest didn't look the same anymore. The path we had taken was gone, swallowed by shifting shadows. "We need to go," Lily said, gripping my arm. Then the cabin doors started creaking open, one by one. Not all the way, just enough for darkness to peer through, enough to let us know something was inside. We ran. Branches clawed at our clothes as we sprinted through the trees, our breath ragged. The forest seemed endless now, twisting and shifting around us. I swore I could hear footsteps, just behind us, matching our pace. Then, silence. We stopped, gasping for air. The trees had opened into a clearing, the normal hiking trail just ahead. We looked back. The path we had run through was gone. No sign of the village, no cabins, just dense, untouched forest. "We didn't imagine that," Ethan panted. Lily's hands were shaking. "No one will believe us." She was right. When we checked online later, there was no record of any village in those woods. No ruins, no history, and yet some nights when the wind is still, I swear I can hear it. 3 slow knocks. Waiting. We had been hiking for hours, the thick trees closing in around us as we ventured deeper into the forest. It was supposed to be a simple day trip, just a quick hike through the woods and back to the car by dusk. But somewhere along the way, we lost the trail. At first, it didn't seem like a big deal. The forest was dense, yes, but we were experienced hikers. We figured we'd find the trail again. But after an hour of searching, it became clear we had veered far off course. The trees looked unfamiliar. The light was beginning to fade, and the sun dipped low behind the canopy. "We need to turn back," said Emma, glancing nervously at the sky. "It's getting dark." "I know," I said, but even as I spoke, I wasn't sure which direction we had come from. The woods had started to feel wrong. The silence was deep. Too deep. No birds, no insects, no rustling of small creatures. Just the faint sound of our footsteps on the forest floor. We kept walking, trying to retrace our steps. But every time we turned, the trees looked the same. The path seemed to stretch on, and we realized we were no longer on any recognizable trail. "This doesn't feel right," Sarah said. "Where's the trail?" I stopped walking and looked around. The trees towered over us like silent sentinels. The air had grown cold, and there was an eerie stillness about the place. I didn't want to say it aloud, but I couldn't shake the feeling that we were being watched. "We should head toward that clearing up ahead," I suggested, trying to sound calm. "Maybe we'll see the trail from there." We walked toward the clearing, but as we neared it, the odd feeling grew stronger. It was like the air itself was thicker here, and the trees around the clearing were unnaturally still. When we stepped into the clearing, we stopped short. The ground was covered in what looked like old, weathered stones, some of them half buried in the dirt. They formed a rough circle in the middle of the clearing. "What is this?" Emma asked, bending down to inspect one of the stones. I didn't answer. The hair on the back of my neck stood up as I glanced around. The clearing felt too symmetrical, too deliberate. "Let's get out of here," Sarah said urgently. "This place is creeping me out." We turned to leave, but the moment we did, the woods felt different. The path we thought we had been following had vanished. In its place, thick brush and brambles had grown up, blocking our way. "How the hell did that happen?" I muttered. There was a trail here, I swear. The sky was darkening quickly now, and the temperature seemed to drop. We had no choice but to find shelter for the night. I suggested we head back to the clearing. At least we could make a fire there and figure things out in the morning. But as we started to walk back toward the center of the clearing, the oddest thing happened. The stones had shifted. They hadn't just moved slightly, they had rearranged themselves. The circle was tighter now, the stones closer together. I stepped forward and reached out to touch one, but something stopped me. A sudden feeling, like an electric charge, ran through my fingertips. My whole body tensed. "We're not alone," Emma whispered. I looked around, and that's when I saw it. In the distance, barely visible through the trees, a figure stood watching us. It was too far to make out any details, but it was tall and hunched, standing unnaturally still just beyond the edge of the clearing. "Did you see that?" Sarah asked, her voice barely audible. Before I could answer, the figure was gone, melting into the shadows of the forest like it had never been there. "We need to get back to the cabin," I said, my voice tense. "Now!" We turned to leave, but as we did, the forest seemed to shift again. The trees weren't where they had been before. The path that had once led us forward was now blocked by thick brambles, and everything looked wrong. It was as if the forest itself had moved, trapping us. Then came the whispers. It started as a low murmur, like wind through the branches, but the voices became clearer, soft, pleading words in a language none of us recognized. It was as though the forest itself was speaking to us, trying to communicate. We bolted in the opposite direction, desperate to break free from whatever was holding us. After what felt like hours of stumbling through the woods, we emerged back, onto the main trail. The moonlight broke through the canopy, and we realized we had somehow found our way back. We didn't stop until we reached the cabin. The door slammed shut behind us, and we didn't speak for a long time. The woods outside were quiet again, but the air felt thick and heavy, like something was still watching us. We left the island the next morning, and we never spoke about the events of that night again. But I know one thing for sure. The forest is not as it seems. The trees hide secrets, and some paths are best left untrodden. It was supposed to be an easy hike, a weekend trip into the woods to unwind. Me, Mark, and Jenna. We'd chosen a remote trail far from the usual crowds, an area not listed on any tourist maps, but still well known to locals for its breathtaking views. We set off early in the morning, with the sun still low, the forest thick and damp with dew. The trees towered above us as we walked deeper into the woods. The air was cool and smelled of pine and earth. It felt like we were the only people on the planet, completely alone in this vast green sea. The path twisted and turned, leading us up steep hills and across babbling brooks. We joked and laughed, our voices echoing through the trees until we came to a clearing. It was beautiful. Almost. Too beautiful. A small meadow surrounded by dense forest on all sides. At the far end of the meadow stood an old stone structure, half collapsed, vines curling up the crumbling walls. It was a ruin, the kind you'd expect to see in a forgotten fairy tale. The air felt heavy here, the silence too perfect. No birds, no wind. "I don't like this place," Mark said, eyeing the ruin warily. "What?" "It's just an old building," Jenna replied, shrugging it off. "It's cool, let's explore." We walked toward it, but as we got closer, I began to feel uneasy. The silence felt unnatural. No sounds of animals, no rustling leaves, just an eerie stillness. I glanced around, expecting to see something move in the trees, but nothing. The ruin's walls were thick with ivy, and the stone seemed cold to the touch. We walked inside. There was nothing in there, just empty air and old, cracked stone. I could feel the weight of the place pressing in on me. Jenna and Mark went further into the ruin, but I stayed near the entrance, staring out at the meadow. Then I heard it, a faint whisper, just beyond the edge of the trees. It sounded like voices, but too soft to make out. I squinted into the darkness of the woods, but there was nothing there. I called to Jenna and Mark, but they were too far inside the ruin to hear me. I took a step forward, straining to listen. The voices grew louder, and then a laugh, high-pitched, strange. It wasn't one of us. I felt a chill run through me. "Mark!" I called, louder this time. No answer. I turned to the ruin, where I could still hear their voices, but they were different now, muffled, distorted. I took another step into the ruin, but the air felt thicker, colder. My feet moved on their own, and before I knew it, I was inside the dark stone structure, looking around for my friends. "Mark? Jenna?" My voice echoed, but it didn't sound like mine. The words felt strange, hollow, as if the walls were absorbing them. I felt a sudden pull to the far side of the ruin, towards a narrow opening in the stone. Without thinking, I walked toward it. Just as I was about to pass through the opening, a loud, jarring sound rang out. A deep, low rumble like thunder, but without the storm. The ground beneath me shook for a moment, and I stumbled back, panic flooding my chest. Then everything went silent again. I stood still, heart racing, straining to hear anything. The eerie stillness was back, but this time it was even worse. I could feel it. Something was watching me. I turned and sprinted back to the meadow, my pulse thundering in my ears. There, at the edge of the clearing, I saw Mark and Jenna standing frozen, staring at the forest. They didn't move, didn't speak. "What's wrong?" I gasped, running to them. Mark slowly turned toward me, his face pale. "Did you hear it?" he whispered, his voice shaky. I nodded, my breath shallow. The voices, the laugh, Jenna shivered. It sounded like it was right behind us. We stood together in the middle of the meadow, staring into the dark forest. The voices had stopped, but the stillness felt wrong. The air was thick, as though something was waiting just beyond the trees, something we couldn't see but could feel. The trees were silent now, but their shadows seemed to stretch longer than they should. Then, as quickly as it had started, the atmosphere lightened. The heaviness lifted, and the wind picked up again, rustling the leaves. We didn't speak for a long time, just stood there in that strange silence, wondering what we had heard, what we had felt. Finally, Mark broke the quiet. "Let's go," he said, his voice firm but nervous. "We've seen enough." We didn't need to say anything else. We turned and left, walking quickly down the trail, the strange sensation never quite leaving us. When we finally made it back to the main path, we didn't look back. The rest of the hike was uneventful, but as the sun began to set, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was still in the woods, watching us, waiting. We never spoke of the ruin again. To this day, I can't help but wonder, was it just the wind? Or had we stumbled upon something older, something that didn't want to be disturbed? The idea of exploring a forgotten place appealed to us, especially in the fall, with the forest cloaked in golden leaves and the air crisp. We set out early, the sun barely peeking through the trees and the forest alive with the sounds of birds and rustling leaves. The trail was well marked at first, but as we ventured deeper, the path grew less defined. The trees seemed to close in around us, their towering trunks making the world feel smaller, more claustrophobic. We laughed it off at first, making jokes about how eerie it felt. "Come on, it's just a hike," Tom said, trying to keep the mood light. But even he couldn't ignore the growing sense of unease. The deeper we went, the quieter it got. The usual sounds of the forest, birds, insects, seemed to fade. All we could hear was the crunch of our boots on the leaves, and even that felt louder than usual. Mia stopped and pointed ahead. "Look, there's a clearing up ahead. I think we're almost there." We pushed forward, reaching the clearing, but it was unlike anything we'd expected. In the center was a stone structure, crumbling and covered in vines, its windows shattered. It was the remains of a small village, forgotten by time, tucked away in the heart of the woods. We walked cautiously around the buildings, peering through broken windows into rooms that were dark and silent. There was something unsettling about the place, but we didn't know why. We explored the ruins for a while, taking photos and joking nervously. Suddenly, Noah, who had wandered off a little further than the rest of us, called out, "Hey, you guys should see this." We followed his voice to a narrow trail leading deeper into the forest. The path wasn't on our map, and the trees here looked different, twisted, older, as though they had been standing far longer than the ones on the main trail. "That doesn't look like it goes anywhere good," Mia said, her voice tinged with concern. But Noah, always the adventurous one, was already on his way down the path, motioning for us to follow. We hesitated, but curiosity got the best of us. 1. By 1, we stepped onto the narrow trail, the trees growing denser around us, casting long shadows in the late afternoon light. The further we went, the stranger things felt. The air turned colder. The once vibrant sounds of the forest had turned into a low, unnatural hum. The trees seemed to shift subtly, their branches twisting in odd directions. We kept walking, but there was an odd pressure in the air, something that felt like it was pushing in on us from all sides. "Do you guys hear that?" Noah asked, his voice shaky now. We listened. At first, it was a whisper, distant but clear. It wasn't the wind, it wasn't the trees. It was a voice. No, multiple voices, hushed, faint, and almost pleading. "Is it coming from the village?" Mia whispered, her eyes wide with fear. I shook my head. "No, this isn't from the village. We're too far away." But the whispering kept growing louder, clearer. It was almost as if the trees themselves were speaking, their voices weaving together in a frantic, rhythmic chant. Suddenly, the path ahead of us grew darker, even though the sun hadn't set yet. A thick fog rolled in, blanketing the trail in an eerie haze. We couldn't see more than a few feet in front of us. "Okay, I think we need to go back," I said, my voice now tight with fear. But as we turned around, the trail we had walked on moments before seemed different. It was no longer the same path. The trees that had once framed the way we came were now twisted, their branches interlocking like unnatural barriers. The fog seemed to thicken, making it impossible to see the village or even the main trail behind us. "Where the hell are we?" Tom said, his voice strained. We tried walking back in the direction we came, but no matter how many steps we took, the path never seemed to open up. The whispering grew louder, closer now, and the temperature dropped. Every time we thought we saw a break in the trees, it was just another layer of fog. Then, as quickly as it had appeared, the whispering stopped. The air was deathly still. We stood there in silence, sweat on our brows, hearts pounding. And then, a faint figure emerged from the mist ahead, a tall, shadowy figure standing motionless in the fog. It had no discernible features, just a dark silhouette against the white haze. We froze, unable to move. It didn't approach. It just stood there, staring at us, its presence overwhelming. After what felt like an eternity, the figure began to slowly fade back into the mist. And just like that, the fog started to lift. The trail in front of us returned to its normal state, the trees no longer twisted, the atmosphere lighter. "We're getting out of here," I said, and this time we didn't hesitate. We ran back toward the village, and the moment we reached the clearing, the forest felt normal again. The air was warmer. The sounds of the forest returned to their usual rhythm. We had been hiking for hours, the dense trees above us blocking out the sun, when we stumbled across the abandoned village. It was hidden deep in the woods, far from any trail we knew of, and it looked like it had been untouched for decades. The houses were overgrown with vines, their wooden walls weathered and cracked. No one had lived here for a long time, but there was something unsettling about the place. It was me, Jack, and Eliza. We'd decided to spend the weekend hiking through the forest, enjoying nature away from the noise of the city. We'd set up camp earlier that day, near a creek, and after a hearty meal, we decided to explore the surrounding area. "I can't believe this is just here," Eliza whispered, her voice full of awe as she stepped closer to the first house. "It looks like a ghost town." The village was small, with only a handful of houses scattered along a dirt road. There was an eerie stillness in the air, and the only sound was the rustling of leaves and the occasional distant bird call. I could feel something was off, but I didn't want to ruin the mood, so I stayed silent. Jack, always the adventurous one, was already poking around inside one of the houses. "It's like time just stopped here," Jack said, his voice echoing back to us. He stepped through the threshold of a house and we followed him inside. The air was stale, thick with dust. The floorboards creaked under our feet as we walked through the rooms, finding nothing but remnants of a forgotten past. A broken chair, old papers, a rusted pot. There were no signs of life, but the longer we stayed, the more I started to feel like we weren't alone. We moved through the village, house by house, each one looking more decayed than the last. It wasn't long before we found a small church at the edge of the village. Its steeple had fallen, and the door hung loosely on its hinges. Jack pushed the door open and we stepped inside. "Hello?" Eliza called out, her voice trembling slightly as it echoed in the hollow interior. No answer, just the faint smell of mildew and age. The pews were overturned, and strange symbols were scratched into the wooden floor. We didn't know what they meant, but they sent a chill down my spine. Then we heard it, a soft, shuffling sound like footsteps, but they didn't sound like they were coming from outside. They were inside the church, but no one was there. "What the hell was that?" I whispered. Jack turned pale. "Let's get out of here." We hurried out of the church, but when we turned back to the village road, everything had changed. The sky was darker, the trees seemed closer, and the path that had been so clear earlier now appeared different, twisted. "Where's the way out?" Eliza asked, her voice quivering with panic. We started to walk back in the direction we thought we came from, but the trees loomed taller and the path forked in ways we didn't remember. It felt like the forest itself was shifting, trapping us. The shuffling sound returned, louder now. It was coming from all around us, from the houses, from the trees, but when we turned to look, there was no one there. Jack's face was tight with fear. "We need to stay together. Don't split up." The air grew colder and the leaves seemed to rustle in strange patterns like whispers. as we moved deeper into the woods, we noticed something in the trees. Small, pale figures barely visible between the branches. They didn't look human, but they watched us, unmoving. And then the most unsettling thing happened. We heard voices, soft, distant voices, too faint to understand, but clearly calling us. The voices were not from any of us. They came from all. Directions, circling us. "We need to go now," I said, my throat tight. "Now!" We began to run, not knowing where we were going, just desperate to get away. The shuffling noise followed us, growing louder, and the air seemed thicker, harder to breathe. The village and the woods seemed to close in on us, the trees bending toward us like they were alive, pressing us deeper into the darkness. Then, as suddenly as it had started, the sound stopped. We found ourselves standing at the edge of the forest. The village was gone. It had vanished into the trees, leaving only the cold, heavy air behind. We didn't speak a word as we hurried back to our campsite. When we got there, the fire was still burning, but we didn't feel safe anymore. The warmth of the fire did little to calm our nerves. That night, we heard whispers on the wind, too soft to understand but unmistakable. We never spoke of the village again, but we knew one thing. We'd stumbled upon something that had been buried in the forest for a reason. We didn't mean to get lost. It started as a simple day hike, just me, Kate, and Ben. The forest was dense and ancient, with towering trees that had stood for centuries, their trunks wrapped in thick moss. The air smelled of earth and pine, and every step felt like we were walking through a living, breathing world. We had been hiking for hours, the trail long abandoned by others, just the three of us and the sounds of the forest. We passed over streams, through thick patches of ferns, and beneath canopies so thick that the sun barely pierced through. The deeper we went, the more the forest felt like a world of its own, untouched and mysterious. As dusk approached, the atmosphere changed. The temperature dropped and the light began to fade, turning the woods into an eerie, shadowed place. Kate suggested we start heading back, but Ben was determined to keep going. "We're so close to the old cabin," he said, referring to a rundown shack we'd read about online. "It'll only be another 20 minutes. Against our better judgment, we followed him. The path became harder to follow and the trees seemed to close in around us, their limbs like skeletal hands reaching down to grab us. Soon, the trail disappeared completely, leaving nothing but dense underbrush and thick darkness. "Ben," I said, my voice tight, "this doesn't feel right. We've been walking for way longer than we should have." Ben just laughed, though it sounded strained. "We're fine. We're just in the thick of it. We'll turn around soon." But I wasn't so sure. The forest had become unnervingly quiet. No birds, no insects, just the sound of our footsteps crunching on the fallen leaves. It felt as though the woods were watching us, waiting for something. The breeze picked up, a faint whisper passing through the trees, though it was hard to tell where it was coming from. "Do you hear that?" Kate asked, stopping dead in her tracks. At first, I didn't, but then I heard it too. A soft, rhythmic thumping in the distance. It was like the sound of something large and heavy moving through the woods. "Probably just a bear or something," Ben said with a dismissive wave, but there was something in his eyes that didn't match his confident tone. The thumping grew louder, closer. It was almost as if it was pacing around us, circling the area. We turned in a slow circle, trying to pinpoint the source, but the forest was so thick that we couldn't see beyond a few feet. Then, out of nowhere, the thumping stopped. The silence was deafening. Kate spoke first, her voice trembling. "This isn't funny anymore, Ben." I could feel my heart race and my instincts screamed at me to turn back, but Ben wasn't listening. "Come on, just a little further. We're almost there." We pushed on, but now we were all aware of the creeping sense of being watched. I could feel eyes on us from the shadows, the hairs on the back of my neck prickling. Every rustle in the leaves, Every movement of the wind felt menacing. Then, I saw it. A figure, barely visible between the trees. It was tall and thin, with limbs that seemed impossibly long. It wasn't quite human, but it was moving deliberately, watching us. I froze, my breath catching in my throat. "Ben," I whispered, urgently, but when I turned to him, he was already looking past me, his face pale. He had seen it too. The figure didn't move, but its presence was suffocating. The forest had become a cage, and we were its prey. The rhythmic thumping started again, this time much closer. I didn't need to ask. We all knew it wasn't the sound of a bear. Kate gripped my arm, her eyes wide with fear. "We need to go, now." Without another word, we turned and ran. The sound of footsteps, heavy, thudding, followed us, echoing in the stillness. But whenever we glanced back, there was nothing. The trees around us seemed to twist, their shapes distorting, as if trying to trap us. We ran, stumbling over roots, crashing through bushes, not caring about the direction. All that mattered was getting away from whatever was out there, in the shadows, watching us. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, we broke through the trees and stumbled onto the familiar path that led back to the parking lot. The air felt lighter, the forest behind us no longer oppressive. We stopped, gasping for breath, our hearts still racing. Ben looked at me and Kate, his face pale. "That wasn't normal, right?" "No," I said, my voice shaking. "That was not normal." We didn't speak much on the walk back to the car, each of us lost in our thoughts. The strange thing in the woods, the sound that had followed us, still haunted me. As we drove away, I looked back at the forest, its dark outline against the fading light. I couldn't shake the feeling that something was still out there, watching us from the depths of the trees. We never went back. It was supposed to be a quick, peaceful hiking trip through the woods. Just me, Ethan, and Lila, trying to escape the noise of the city. We planned on taking a short trail through an old part of the forest known for its tall pines and untouched beauty. The kind of forest that, at first glance, feels timeless. We packed light, eager to spend a day immersed in nature. The trail was quiet at first. Birds chirped, leaves rustled, and our footsteps seemed to echo through the trees. We were deep in the forest by midday, the sun filtering through the thick canopy above, casting dappled light on the forest floor. Ethan joked about how peaceful it all felt. "Too peaceful," Lila added with a laugh. But as we pressed on, something shifted. The air seemed to grow still, the usual forest noises fading into an unnerving silence. At first, I thought it was nothing. Maybe we'd wandered into a quieter part of the woods, but Lila was the first to notice it. "Do you hear that?" she asked, her voice tight with uncertainty. We all stopped. I listened closely. The silence was oppressive, but then, faintly, there was something else. A whisper, barely audible but unmistakable. It was coming from the direction we'd just walked. "Probably the wind," I said, trying to keep the mood light, but even I didn't believe it. The trees weren't moving. The air wasn't stirring. It was too still. We decided to keep moving, but the whispers grew louder as we walked, subtle at first, like someone was calling us. But there was no one around. "Maybe it's an animal," Ethan suggested, but his voice sounded uncertain too. The path became narrower as we ventured deeper into the forest, the trees now towering over us like ancient sentinels. The whispers seemed to circle around us, coming from all directions. It wasn't a language I could understand. It was just a soft, constant murmur, as though the forest itself was speaking, and we were meant to listen. "I don't like this," Lila muttered, gripping her backpack tighter. "This doesn't feel right." I was about to say something to reassure her when we came across something strange. The trail opened into a small clearing, and in the center, there was a large stone circle. It was old, too old, and the stones seemed to pulse with an eerie energy. The moment we stepped into the clearing, the whispers stopped. The air felt thicker now, almost as if it were pressing down on us. The sudden quiet was more unnerving than the murmurs had been. I tried to shake it off, but something about that circle made me uneasy. "Maybe we should turn back," Ethan said, his voice low. His usual confidence was gone. "Yeah," Lila agreed. "This place feels off." As we turned to retrace our steps, the whispers returned, louder this time, almost frantic. It wasn't the wind. It wasn't animals. It was something else. It was like the trees themselves were alive, trying to communicate with us, warning us, urging us to leave. I looked. Behind us, the clearing was gone. "What the hell?" I said, stopping dead in my tracks. The forest had closed in around us. The path we had been walking on was no longer visible. "We've been walking in circles," Ethan said, panic creeping into his voice. "No, we're not," I replied, though I wasn't sure myself. The trees, the rocks, everything, nothing, looked familiar anymore. It was as if the forest had shifted. We tried to retrace our steps, but each way we turned led us deeper into the unknown. The air felt colder. The whispers now joined by strange noises, footsteps that didn't belong to us, snapping branches, a distant cry. Something was moving in the woods, watching us. We couldn't see it, but we could feel its presence. Finally, Lila, nearly on the verge of tears, said, "We need to get out of here, now." I agreed. The forest felt like it was closing in on us, trapping us. But then, through the thick trees, I saw something, a faint glow. It was a light, flickering, like a lantern just ahead. We stumbled toward it, desperate for any sign of safety. When we reached the light, we found ourselves back at the edge of the forest, right where we had started. The sun had already begun to set, the sky painted with streaks of orange and pink. The whispers were gone, replaced by the normal sounds of the forest. Birds chirped. The wind blew gently through the trees. We stood there, panting and confused, looking around. There was no sign of the stone circle, no sign of the eerie presence that had surrounded us. "I don't understand," Lila said, still wide-eyed. "How did we get back here?" "I don't know," I replied. "But I don't care. Let's just go home." We made our way back to the parking lot without speaking much, all of us unnerved by what had happened. That night, as we sat in silence, I couldn't shake the feeling that something had been watching us in those woods, waiting. The forest had spoken to us, and it wasn't ready to let go of its secrets. We never went back. It was supposed to be a simple hiking trip. My friends and I, Maya, Ethan, and Jacob, decided to explore a secluded part of the national forest that had always intrigued us. It was known for its dense woods, but we figured we'd be fine. After all, we had maps, and it was just a weekend hike. We arrived at the trailhead in the morning, greeted by towering trees and the smell of wet earth. The air was crisp, and the sun filtered through the leaves, casting dappled light on the path ahead. The forest seemed alive with the sounds of birds and rustling leaves, but there was an underlying stillness, like the woods were waiting for something. By midday, we had left the main trail behind, following a less trodden path that veered off into the deeper parts of the forest. The trees grew thicker here, their branches forming an almost perfect canopy above us. The sunlight barely reached the forest floor, leaving it cool and shadowy. We laughed and joked as we hiked, unaware of how far we were drifting. Around the time we thought we should turn back, we came upon something strange. A small clearing opened up before us, but the sight wasn't peaceful. The trees surrounding it were twisted, their bark blackened, their limbs contorted into unnatural shapes. In the center of the clearing, there was an old stone well, half covered by moss and vines, looking as if it had been untouched for centuries. "This place feels off," Maya said, her voice low. She was always the most sensitive to strange energy, and I could see the unease in her eyes. "Let's not stay long," Ethan suggested, clearly uncomfortable. He looked around, his eyes scanning the shadows like he was expecting something to move. We all nodded, and we began to leave the clearing. That's when the air seemed to change. It grew heavier, almost suffocating. The birds stopped singing, and the breeze stilled. We glanced at each other, suddenly feeling like we weren't alone. The hairs on the back of my neck stood up, and I had the distinct feeling that the forest was watching us. "We should go back now," Jacob said, his voice tense. "This place doesn't feel right." But when we turned to retrace our steps, the path we had just walked on was gone. The trees, which had once lined the trail, now seemed to have shifted, their trunks twisted in different directions. The clearing was still there, but the surrounding woods were unfamiliar, like they had changed overnight. Panic started to creep in. The familiar sounds of the forest, the wind, the chirping of birds, had been replaced with an eerie silence, like the forest itself was holding its breath. I reached for my phone, but there was no signal. Maya tried calling out, but her voice was swallowed by the thick air. "Stay close," Ethan whispered, gripping his backpack tightly. We huddled together and began walking in what we thought was the direction we had come from, but every turn seemed to bring us deeper into the woods. It was as if the trees were closing in on us, their branches reaching out like claws. Then we heard it, a low whisper, too soft to make out the words, but unmistakable. It came from behind us, from all around us, like the forest itself was speaking. We spun around, but there was nothing there, just the shifting shadows between the trees. "I don't like this," Jacob muttered, his voice shaky. "I swear something's following us." The whispering grew louder, and the feeling of being watched intensified. We broke into a run, pushing through the dense underbrush. Every step felt heavier, like the forest was holding us back. The trees seemed to sway as though they were moving in time with us, trapping us in their labyrinth. Then, out of nowhere, a figure appeared. It was just a flash of movement, like a shadow darting between the trees. We froze. It was tall, too, tall for a person, and it had long, spindly arms that seemed to stretch unnaturally as it moved. The air around us grew colder, and we all felt the chill creep into our bones. But when we blinked, the figure was gone. The whispering stopped, and the forest seemed to exhale a collective sigh, as though the tension had lifted. We stood there, panting, afraid to move. Finally, we found the path again. It was as if the forest had released its grip on us. We didn't stop running until we reached the edge of the woods, where the sunlight seemed brighter and warmer. We didn't speak for a long while, each of us processing what had just happened. When we finally looked back at the forest, it was quiet, just as it had been before. But this time, we couldn't shake the feeling that the woods were still watching, waiting for us to return. We left that day, but none of us ever spoke of going back to that part of the forest again. It started as a simple weekend getaway, just me, Ben, and Rachel. We'd been wanting to do a camping trip for ages, and when we found a secluded spot deep in the forest, far from any trails or park rangers, we knew it was the perfect place to disconnect. We packed our tents, food, and sleeping bags and set off, ready for an adventure. The sun was beginning to set by the time we reached our campsite, a small clearing surrounded by thick trees. The air smelled fresh, the forest quiet except for the chirping of distant birds. We set up our camp and lit a fire, sitting around it with beers in hand, enjoying the last light of day. The shadows of the trees stretched long across the clearing, as the sun dipped below the horizon. The first sign something was wrong came when we heard the tapping. It was faint at first, like something small hitting the ground in a steady rhythm. At first, I thought it was a woodpecker, but the noise didn't stop, and it didn't sound like any bird I'd ever heard. Ben looked around, frowning. "What the hell is that?" Rachel stood up, eyes scanning the darkness. "Probably just an animal. There are a lot of them out here." But the tapping continued, louder now, almost like someone was drumming their fingers against the trunk of a tree. We all grew quiet, listening. The forest was unusually still. No wind, no rustling leaves, just that rhythmic tapping. Then, in the distance, we heard another sound. This time, a low, almost inaudible hum, like a distant voice whispering something unintelligible. "That's weird," Ben said, standing up. "I'll go check it out." Rachel and I exchanged uneasy glances, but Ben, ever the brave one, started walking toward the noise. We watched him disappear into the trees, his figure swallowed up by the growing darkness. Minutes passed. Then it felt like hours. "I'm going to look for him," Rachel said, her voice tight with worry. I hesitated. "Rachel, wait. He'll come back. Maybe he just got distracted or—" But before I could finish, she was already heading into the woods after him. I sat there, feeling more uneasy by the second. The fire crackled softly, but the night felt colder, heavier. I stared into the darkness, waiting. Then the tapping started again, but this time it was much closer. I could hear it clearly now, coming from just beyond the firelight where the trees met the edge of the clearing. My heart raced as I stood up. "Rachel! Ben!" I called out, my voice trembling. There was no answer. I felt the urge to run, but something kept me rooted to the spot. The hum from earlier returned, but now it sounded clearer, like it was coming from all around me. The tapping grew louder, almost like someone, was moving through the trees. I backed up slowly, my mind racing. Where were they? Why? Weren't they back yet? I was about to call out again when I saw something. A flash of movement just beyond the tree line. A figure, tall and cloaked in shadow, standing completely still. Then, it was gone. Vanished. My blood ran cold. I spun around to run back to the campsite, but before I could, I heard a voice behind me. "Don't go back there." I froze. The voice was low, gravelly, and it didn't sound like Rachel or Ben. It didn't sound like anyone I knew. The voice came again, this time closer. "They're already gone." I turned around, but there was no one there. The forest was still. The tapping stopped. The humming ceased. It was as if everything had gone quiet, all at once. I didn't wait to find out what it meant. I turned and ran, my legs moving faster than I thought possible. I stumbled through the woods, branches whipping at my face until I found the clearing. Again, the campfire still burning. And there they were, Rachel and Ben, sitting on the ground by the fire looking at me like nothing had happened. "What took you so long?" Ben asked, as if he hadn't just been gone for what felt like hours. I was panting, heart hammering in my chest. Where did you go? I couldn't find you." Rachel looked confused. "We were right here the whole time, just sitting, by the fire." I shook my head. "No, you weren't. You were out there, in the woods." They exchanged glances but didn't argue. They had no idea what I was talking about. I tried to explain, tried to tell them about the voice, the tapping, the figure in the trees, but every word felt hollow. They hadn't heard a thing. I stayed awake the rest of the night, watching the shadows of the forest. But nothing came. No more tapping. No whispers. Just the occasional rustle of leaves in the wind. The next morning, we packed up quickly and left the forest, the strange feeling hanging heavy in the air. When we passed by the edge of the woods, I looked back at the trees one last time. There, just for a second, I thought I saw a figure watching us from the shadows. But when I blinked, it was gone. We had been hiking for hours. The forest was dense, the trees towering over us like silent sentinels, their branches intertwined high above, blocking out much of the sunlight. Just the crunch of leaves and twigs underfoot kept us grounded in reality. Me, Emma, and Jake, 3 friends out for a weekend adventure, had decided to explore an area known for its eerie, abandoned village deep in the woods. We'd heard the rumors. The village had been deserted for decades, its homes left, to rot under layers of moss and vines. Local legends said the place was haunted, and some even spoke of strange happenings in the woods around it. But we were young and fearless. We wanted an adventure. We didn't believe in ghosts. By the time we reached the village ruins, the sky had darkened and a fog had begun rolling in from the east. It wasn't a thick fog, but it made the air feel heavy, almost suffocating. We explored the remnants of the village, crumbling stone buildings overtaken by nature, until we found the old church. The doors were wide open, but we didn't go inside. Something about the place felt wrong. We turned to leave. That's when we saw it. A massive oak tree, standing alone just beyond the village, its twisted branches reaching up like gnarled fingers. It wasn't like any other tree in the forest. It was too large, too dark, and there was something strange about the way it loomed over us. "Let's check it out," Jake said, always the brave one. Despite a nagging sense of unease in my gut, I followed them. We made our way toward the tree, our footsteps muffled by the damp ground. As we approached the hollow at the base of the oak, we felt a sudden drop in temperature. The air around the tree felt colder, as if a breeze had passed through, even though the air was still. Emma shivered and hugged herself, and Jake fidgeted with his backpack, suddenly uneasy. "This place is creepy," Emma whispered. "I don't like it," I agreed. There was something about the tree, an oppressive, unnatural energy in the air around it. But Jake was already peering inside the hollow, his flashlight illuminating the dark space. "Hey, look at this," Jake said, crouching down. He reached into the hollow and pulled out a small weathered box. The wood was dark, nearly black from age, and it had strange carvings along its sides. "What is that?" Emma asked, stepping closer. "I don't know," Jake replied, "but it looks old, like something buried here a long time." We stared at the box, and for a moment, everything was still. The fog had thickened, and we could barely make out the path behind us. The forest seemed to close in around us, the trees leaning closer, their branches creaking in the silence. Suddenly, we heard a noise, soft at first, like a faint whisper. We froze, listening. The whispering grew louder, like voices calling from the trees. I turned to Emma and Jake, but they were looking at the tree, their faces pale. From the hollow oak, a shadow seemed to shift. It was subtle at first, just a flicker at the edge of our vision. But then it grew. A figure, tall and gaunt, emerged from the darkness of the tree. It had no face, just a featureless shape cloaked in darkness. "Run," I whispered, but the words barely left my lips before the figure took a step toward us. We didn't need any more encouragement. We bolted. Branches snapped behind us as we sprinted through the forest, the shadow's footsteps echoing in our ears. The fog thickened, blurring our vision, making it feel like we were running through a nightmare. But we didn't stop. We had no idea how far we were from the village or the trail, but we just ran. The whispering followed us, growing louder, as if the very trees were calling our names. We could hear the faint rustling of footsteps, too fast and too close, but every time we looked over our shoulders, there was nothing there. Nothing but the trees, towering over us like watching giants. Finally, we stumbled upon the trail. The fog was thinning now, and we could see the path ahead leading out of the woods. We didn't speak, didn't look back, just kept running until we reached the safety of our car. We didn't stop to ask ourselves what we'd seen or heard. We didn't even speak as we drove back through the night, the trees growing smaller and smaller in the rearview mirror. The hollow oak? It was still there, in the woods, waiting, and I don't think it'll ever let go of what it found. It was supposed to be an ordinary hiking trip through the woods. Just me, Jack, and Olivia. A weekend away from the city, a break from the noise, exploring the dense forests that stretched for miles. We had mapped out a simple route to follow, taking us through a few well-known trails and ending at a small remote village we had read about online. No one lived there anymore, they said, just a ghost town lost to time. We set out early. the weather perfect for a hike. The sun filtered through the canopy of trees above, casting dappled light on the forest floor. The air smelled fresh, earthy, and clean. The deeper we went, the quieter it became, with only the occasional rustle of leaves or distant bird calls breaking the silence. After a few hours of walking, we found a narrow path that wasn't on the map. Curious, we decided to follow it, wondering where it might lead. The trees seemed to grow taller, thicker, and the forest felt alive in a way that was hard to explain. The path wound deeper into the woods, and soon we realized we hadn't seen any other hikers for miles. No animals either, just an eerie stillness that made us feel like we were intruding. Eventually, we came upon a clearing, and in the middle of it stood the village. It was strange. The buildings were old, worn down by decades of neglect, but they still stood. Wooden houses with crumbling stone foundations, windows shattered, doors hanging off their hinges. The village was smaller than we had imagined, with only a handful of buildings scattered around. "There it is," Olivia whispered, her voice barely audible as we stood at the edge of the clearing. "Let's check it out," Jack said, always the adventurous one. We made our way through the overgrown grass and weeds toward the first house. The front door creaked loudly as Jack pushed it open. Inside, it was dark, musty, and smelled of mildew. The floorboards groaned under our feet, and we tried not to touch anything. The place had been abandoned for years, maybe even longer. "What do you think happened here?" Olivia asked, her voice trembling slightly as she looked around the empty rooms. "I don't know," I said, shivering despite the warmth outside. "But it feels off." As we moved through the village, we noticed something strange. Each house, though abandoned, seemed to have signs of recent activity. Fresh footprints in the dirt, disturbed leaves near the doorways, and even what looked like a small campfire still smoldering behind one of the buildings. But there were no signs of anyone. Suddenly, we heard something. A soft sound at first, like the wind, but it wasn't. A faint, eerie hum coming from somewhere deep in the village. It felt unnatural. We all froze. "Did you hear that?" Jack asked, his eyes wide with unease. "Yeah," Olivia whispered, gripping my arm. "It's coming from the woods." I strained my ears, and the hum grew louder, almost like chanting, rhythmic and low, echoing through the trees surrounding the village. It sounded like voices, but not quite, distorted, muffled, and unnervingly close. The hairs on the back of my neck stood up. "We need to leave." "Now," I said, my voice shaky. But before we could move, the ground beneath us seemed to tremble slightly. The trees rustled as if something was passing through them, though there was no wind. We turned toward the sound, and for a split second, I thought I saw something dart between the trees. Fast, too fast for anything human. A figure, pale and gaunt, disappearing into the forest. "Go! Go!" I shouted, grabbing Olivia's hand. We ran, sprinting through the village and back toward the path we had come from. The hum grew louder, almost like it was following us, always just at the edge of hearing, echoing through the trees like a distant chant. As we reached the edge of the clearing, I glanced over my shoulder. The village was silent again, still, but the feeling remained, like something unseen was watching us from the shadows. I could still hear the soft hum in my ears, though it was quieter now. We didn't stop running until we were miles away, far from the village and deeper into the forest. When we finally paused to catch our breath, we looked back. The village was gone, completely vanished, swallowed by the trees as if it had never been there. We made it back to the trail and eventually to safety, but we never spoke about the village again. The hike was supposed to be a simple escape, a getaway into nature, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was still following us in the woods. And sometimes, when the wind is right, I can still hear that faint hum echoing through the trees. We had been hiking for hours, the thick forest around us growing denser with each step. It was just me, Rachel, and Ben. We had decided to take a detour from our usual trail, lured by the idea of discovering something untouched, something unknown. The forest was beautiful, the air rich with the scent of pine and earth, but the deeper we went, the quieter it became. We hadn't seen another hiker in hours. The only sound was the rustling of leaves beneath our boots. Then, as we rounded a bend, we saw it, an old wooden sign, half covered in moss with the word Veldstad carved into it. Rachel squinted at it. "That name sounds familiar," she muttered. "Wasn't that a village that got abandoned years ago?" We looked around. The trees had parted to reveal a clearing, and in the distance, through the thick fog that had settled, we could make out old, crumbling buildings. It looked like a ghost town. Rotten wood, broken windows, and overgrown vines crawling up the walls. "I don't think we should go in there," Ben said, his voice uneasy. But curiosity got the best of us. We stepped cautiously forward, the ground soft beneath our feet. As we drew closer, the silence became unnerving. Not a bird, not a single animal noise, just stillness. When we reached the first building, an old stone structure that might have been a store or house once, we hesitated. The door was slightly ajar, creaking in the wind like it was inviting us in. Ben was the first to step through. "It's fine," he said, though his voice lacked confidence. "It's probably just an old settlement, nothing to be afraid of." I followed, Rachel close behind. The inside of the building was dark, dust thick in the air. Old furniture was scattered around and cobwebs draped the corners. There were signs of life, long gone, empty shelves, a table with broken chairs, and in the far corner, a faded painting of what seemed like a family. "I don't like this," Rachel whispered. "Let's go back." But before we could leave, something caught my eye. On the wall, faint symbols were scratched into the wood. Circles, lines, and strange markings that made no sense. It looked like some sort of map or pattern. Then I heard it. A soft, muffled sound, like a footstep. We all froze. The air felt heavier, thicker. We glanced at each other wide-eyed. It wasn't the wind. The hairs on my neck stood on end. "We need to go. Now," I said, my voice sharp. But before we could turn around, the door slammed shut behind us, cutting off our only way out. We spun around, panicked, only to hear a low, haunting hum coming from somewhere deeper in the building. "What the hell is that?" Ben asked, his voice trembling. We backed up against the wall, our hearts racing. The hum grew louder, almost like it was coming from the floorboards beneath us. I swallowed hard, trying to steady my breathing. Suddenly, the floor creaked and a cold gust of air swept through the room, extinguishing our flashlights. For a moment, we were plunged into darkness. My mind raced. Was it the wind? Was there someone else here? Then the hum stopped. We waited, breathless, eyes adjusting to the dim light. A few seconds passed in silence before the door creaked open, slowly, as if being pushed by an invisible hand. My heart skipped a beat. Without a word, we bolted for the exit, not daring to look back. The clearing seemed even more ominous now, the fog thicker, the trees pressing in like they were trying to swallow us whole. We didn't stop running until we found the trail again, the distant sounds of the forest returning to our ears. We didn't speak at first, too shaken to say anything. Finally, Rachel broke the silence. "What the hell was that?" "I don't know," Ben said, panting, "but I'm not going back there." We hiked the rest of the day in silence, not even daring to look back toward the clearing. When we finally made it to the main trail, we glanced over our shoulders one last time, and that's when we saw it. A shadow, moving slowly between the trees at the edge of the clearing, watching us. We didn't wait to find out who or what it was. We hurried back to the trailhead, the unsettling feeling still lingering in the air. We never told anyone about the village. To this day, when I close my eyes, I can still see the abandoned houses and hear that soft, haunting hum. But most unsettling of all was the feeling that whatever we had encountered, it wasn't done with us. The plan was simple. Hike a few miles into the woods, set up camp, and enjoy the quiet. But, like any great hike, it was far more thrilling than expected. It started innocently enough. The air was crisp, and the scent of pine filled our lungs as we walked. It was me, Jonah, and Emily. We had been hiking together for years, but this time felt different. The deeper we went into the forest, the more the trees seemed to press in on us. It was as if the forest itself was watching us, waiting. We stopped for a break, sitting on a large fallen log near a creek. Emily was the first to notice it. "Do you hear that?" she asked, her voice low. At first, I thought it was just the wind or the water rushing over rocks, but then I heard it. A soft whispering, just beyond the reach of the trees. It wasn't wind. It wasn't an animal. It sounded like voices, but there were no words, just hushed murmurs, like a conversation happening far away. Jonah raised an eyebrow. "Probably just animals," he said, trying to shrug it off. But there was something in his voice, a hint of unease. "I don't know," I said, glancing around. The woods were unnervingly still, too still. No birds, no rustling of leaves, nothing. The whispering seemed to grow faint, then vanish as quickly as it had come. We packed up and continued our hike, trying to focus on the trail ahead. The path wound deeper into the woods, and soon we found ourselves surrounded by towering trees, their thick trunks blocking out most of the light. The further we went, the more the air felt heavy, as if the forest was pressing in around us. Around dusk, we reached a strange clearing. There were no obvious signs of wildlife, no tracks in the dirt, no plants or trees growing in the usual way. The ground was uneven, as though it had been disturbed recently. But the most unsettling part was the circle of large, ancient trees at the center of the clearing, their bark twisted and gnarled in unnatural ways. "This place feels wrong," Emily said quietly, looking around. "I agree," Jonah muttered, his eyes scanning the clearing. We all felt it, a strange tension in the air. And then, just as we were about to leave, the whispering returned. It was louder now, and it seemed to be coming from the trees themselves. I shivered, stepping back. "What is that?" Jonah's voice was low. "I don't know, but we need to get out of here." But the moment we turned around to leave, the path had changed. The trees that had once stood in a clear line now seemed to be rearranged, forming a maze that was impossible to navigate. We were disoriented, the forest twisting around us as if it had deliberately rearranged itself. The whispering grew louder, now accompanied by strange thumping sounds like footsteps following us. But when we looked back, nothing was there. We rushed forward, desperate to find the trail again, but the trees seemed to close in on us. The more we ran, the more the forest shifted, as if it was alive and determined to trap us within its boundaries. "Where's the trail?" Emily gasped, her breath quickening. I was beginning to panic. "It was just here. I swear it was here." And then, out of the corner of my eye, I saw something. A flash of movement between the trees. A shadow standing perfectly still. My heart leapt into my throat. The whispering grew louder, and now there were other sounds too. Soft footsteps that seemed to echo like something, or someone, was walking just behind us. Suddenly, Jonah stopped dead in his tracks. His face was pale. "Do you see that?" he whispered, pointing ahead. In the center of the path stood a figure. Tall, cloaked in dark rags with its back turned toward us. It didn't move. It didn't even seem to breathe. I couldn't breathe, either. For a long moment, we just stared at it, frozen, our hearts pounding. And then, as suddenly as it had appeared, the figure was gone, disappearing into the trees with a swift, unnatural movement. "Go! Run!" I shouted, grabbing Emily's arm. We sprinted through the forest, barely hearing our own footsteps over the rushing of our hearts. The trees parted, and we found the trail again. It was like a weight had been lifted from us. The forest opened up, and we could see the fading light of the evening sky. The whispering stopped, and the sounds of the woods returned to their normal, comforting hum. We didn't stop running until we reached the edge of the forest. Our legs ached, and our breath was ragged, but we didn't care. The sun was setting, but we weren't about to stay another minute in those woods. As we sat on the edge of the forest, catching our breath, Emily broke the silence. That was unreal. What was that thing? I shook my head. I don't know. But whatever it wasn't part of this world. We had been hiking for hours through the dense woods, following a trail that was supposed to lead us to an old, abandoned village. The air was thick with the scent of damp earth and pine, and the only sounds were the rustling of leaves and our footsteps crunching on the forest floor. There were 3 of us, me, Jake, and Olivia, all eager for a weekend adventure away from the noise of the city. The village had been abandoned for decades, or so we'd heard. Most people said it was just a ghost story, an old myth. But the curiosity had gotten the better of us, and we decided to see it for ourselves. We'd been warned about the forest. Locals said it was strange, full of odd occurrences, but we weren't scared. At least, not yet. As we ventured deeper into the woods, the trail began to grow fainter. The trees around us thickened, their twisted branches intertwining above, blocking out most of the sunlight. The forest was darker now, and the air felt cooler, even though it was still early afternoon. "This place is getting weirder by the minute," Olivia said, breaking the silence. She was a little jumpy, but I didn't blame her. The atmosphere in the woods had changed, like something was watching us. "It's just the woods." "A little too quiet, that's all," Jake replied, trying to keep his voice light, but even he seemed uneasy. We continued on, but the further we went, the more it felt like we were being followed. The wind had picked up, making the trees creak and groan, but every now and then, I thought I heard something else, a soft rustling, like footsteps, coming from behind us. I turned around, but there was nothing there. "You hear that?" I asked, glancing at Jake and Olivia. "Hear what?" Olivia looked up from her map. "That sound, like someone's walking behind us," I said, my voice low. They both looked at me for a moment, then shrugged. "Probably just animals," Jake said, though his eyes didn't look quite as sure now. We decided to push forward, even though the trail was becoming less and less defined. The air grew colder, and I could see my breath in the air as we walked. My skin prickled, and an uneasy feeling settled over me. "Do you think we're lost?" Olivia asked after a long stretch of silence. "No," I said, trying to sound confident. "We're fine. The village should be up ahead." But when we rounded a bend in the path, we stopped dead in our tracks. There, standing in the middle of the trail, was an old wooden cabin. It wasn't on any map we'd seen, and it certainly wasn't the village we were looking for. The cabin looked abandoned, decayed. Its roof was half collapsed, and the windows were boarded up. But what caught my eye wasn't the cabin itself. It was the figure standing in front of it. A person just standing there, looking directly at us. They wore a dark cloak, the hood pulled low over their face so we couldn't see their features. They didn't move, didn't speak. They just stood there, like they were waiting for us. My heart raced. Olivia took a step back, her eyes wide, with fear, while Jake reached for his pocket knife, though he didn't draw it. "Who's there?" I called out, my voice shaky. The figure didn't respond. I glanced at Olivia and Jake, and without a word, we turned and started to walk quickly back the way we came. The forest around us seemed to close in tighter, the shadows lengthening as the sun began to dip lower. I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong, that we weren't alone. And then it happened again. The same soft rustling, like someone was walking behind us, staying just out of sight. I wanted to turn and look, but I didn't dare. My legs moved faster, my breath quickening. I heard Olivia's breathing grow more frantic as we all pushed ahead. "Almost there," I said, though I wasn't sure where "there" was anymore. We finally reached a small clearing, and I let out a breath of relief when I saw the trail markers. But when we stopped to catch our breath, the air grew still. Too still. The sounds of the forest had completely vanished. "Why is it so quiet?" Olivia asked, her voice barely a whisper. I didn't answer. I was looking around, my pulse racing. Then I saw it. The figure, still in the cloak, was standing at the edge of the clearing just at the tree line. They didn't move, didn't speak. They just watched. I grabbed Olivia's arm, pulling her and Jake with me as I turned and ran. We didn't stop until we broke through the woods and emerged onto the main road where our car was parked. I slammed the door behind us, our breaths ragged, and didn't say a word. The air outside the woods felt lighter, warmer. It was only when I started the car that I noticed something chilling. There was a small worn notebook on the passenger seat, right where Olivia had been sitting earlier. I opened it. The first page read, "You shouldn't have come here. We didn't speak on the drive back."